Picture Egypt at its height. The pyramids had already stood for 2,000 years. The Nile still flooded each season, feeding the land. And the pharaohs still wore the crown as god on earth. But by the 6th century BC, the glory of the pharaohs was fading. Egypt was no longer the unstoppable power it had once been. And on one single battlefield, that decline would become permanent. The year was 525 BC. The place was Pelusium, a city at the edge of the Nile Delta, the gateway into Egypt from the east. Here, the Persian Empire under Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, clashed with Pharaoh Psamtik III. What happened on that battlefield didn't just decide who controlled Egypt that year. It ended 3,000 years of pharaohs ruling as masters of their land. From then on, Egypt would never again be truly free. But to understand why, we need to rewind. Egypt at this time was already struggling. The great dynasties of the past, the ones who built temples and monuments, who expanded Egypt's borders deep into Africa and the Levant, were long gone. By the 26th dynasty, when Psamtik III came to the throne, Egypt was holding on more than conquering. Foreign powers circled. Assyrians had invaded earlier. Greek mercenaries were becoming a regular feature of Egyptian armies. And to the east, a new giant had risen, Persia. Cyrus the Great had already carved out a super-empire, swallowing the Medes, Babylonians, and more. When he died, his son Cambyses II took the throne, and his eyes turned toward Egypt. To Cambyses, Egypt was the last great prize in the Near East. Conquering it would not only make Persia supreme, it would also end the last pocket of resistance to his father's dream of a unified empire. Pharaoh Psamtik III knew the danger. He had only just come to power, young and inexperienced, but aware that Persia was coming. He tried to prepare. He called on allies, hiring Greek mercenaries and looking for support from nearby states. But Egypt's politics were fractured, its army not what it once was, and its leadership untested. Against the might of Persia, Egypt was already standing on shaky ground. So when Cambyses marched his army into Egyptian territory, the showdown happened at Pelusium, the entry point where the desert meets the lush Nile Delta. This was the choke point. If Psamtik could hold here, Egypt might stand. If not, the way to Memphis and the heart of the country lay wide open. The armies lined up. On one side, the Persians, disciplined, massive, and backed by years of victories across Mesopotamia. On the other, the Egyptians, proud, desperate, and fighting not just for land, but for their very identity. This was more than a battle. It was a test of whether the age of the pharaohs could survive the new world order. And here's where the story takes a twist almost too strange to believe. Ancient sources, like Herodotus, claim that Cambyses used animals, cats, specifically, as part of his strategy. Egyptians held cats as sacred animals, connected to the goddess Bastet. To harm a cat was considered blasphemy. The Persians supposedly painted cats and other sacred animals on their shields, and may have even driven live animals toward the Egyptian lines. The result? The Egyptians hesitated. They couldn't bring themselves to strike at what they saw as holy. Whether this was fully true or not, the symbolism was powerful. Cambyses turned Egypt's deepest traditions into a weapon against them. The fighting was fierce, but the Persians broke through. Psamtik's army collapsed, retreating toward Memphis. Thousands were killed, and many others captured. Pelusium fell, and with it, the last real line of defense. For Psamtik III, defeat at Pelusium was more than just losing a battle. It was losing Egypt itself. He fled to Memphis, but Cambyses followed. Soon after, Psamtik was captured, paraded as a prisoner, and eventually executed. With that, the line of pharaohs ruling independently ended. Egypt became a province of the Persian Empire. Think about that. 3,000 years of kings who called themselves living gods ended in one defeat. From then on, The pharaoh's crown would always belong to foreigners: Persians, Greeks, Romans. The age of native Egyptian rulers was over. And it all came down to Pelusium, that single battlefield where one young pharaoh tried to hold the line and failed. When Psamtik III fell into Persian hands, Egypt lost more than a king. It lost the image of the pharaoh as untouchable. For 3,000 years, pharaohs had been the center of everything: the divine rulers, the children of the gods, the ones who kept the Nile's floods tied to heaven itself. But once Cambyses paraded Psamtik like a prisoner, the illusion shattered. From that moment, Egypt's rulers would always be at the mercy of outsiders. Cambyses too didn't waste time. He declared himself Pharaoh. Think about that. The son of Cyrus the Great, a Persian conqueror, now wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. The same crown that had once sat on the heads of Ramses, Thutmose, and the builders of the pyramids. To drive it home, he performed the rituals, stood in Egyptian temples, and claimed the gods of Egypt had blessed his rule. For Egyptians, it was a shock. The rituals were familiar, but the man performing them was foreign. Life under Persia wasn't always brutal, but it was different. Cambyses put Persian officials in charge, alongside Egyptian priests and administrators who agreed to serve him. Taxes flowed east, wealth that once stayed along the Nile now funding the Persian court. Egyptian soldiers were forced into Persian campaigns abroad, fighting not for their own pharaoh, but for a distant king. The Persians also weren't always sensitive to Egypt's culture. Some stories say Cambyses insulted Egyptian traditions, mocking their gods, killing sacred animals, even stabbing the Apis bull, a creature Egyptians saw as a divine sign. Whether every story is true or not, the effect was real: resentment. The people no longer felt they were living under their own ruler. They were subjects, and the age of independence was over. But even deeper than politics, something more permanent had shifted. Egypt's defeat at Pelusium broke the rhythm of history. Before, foreign invaders had come and gone: the Hyksos, the Assyrians. But somehow, Egypt had always managed to bounce back, reassert its power, and restore the pharaoh's place. This time was different. Psamtik III's fall marked the last time a native pharaoh ruled with full independence. Every dynasty that came after would be under a shadow. Persia, then Alexander the Great, then the Ptolemies, then Rome. Pharaohs in name, maybe, but never again pharaohs in truth. And this mattered beyond politics. Egypt's culture, its art, its religion, its very identity began to change. The temples still stood, the rituals continued, but power was slipping away. Foreign rulers used the pharaoh's image when it suited them, but everyone knew the authority didn't come from the Nile anymore. It came from elsewhere. The defeat also weakened Egypt's reputation abroad. For centuries, Egypt had been a player in the Eastern Mediterranean. Kingdoms had courted its alliances, feared its armies, and respected its wealth. But after Pelusium, Egypt became a prize to be fought over. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled its grain, its gold, its strategic position. And once Persia showed it could be taken, every future empire would see Egypt as fair game. Psamtik's defeat wasn't just military, it was psychological. It told the world that Egypt, once untouchable, could be conquered. And once that door opened, it never closed again. Egypt under Persian rule was never fully at peace. The defeat at Pelusium may have ended the independence of the pharaohs, but it didn't erase Egyptian pride. People still saw themselves as children of the Nile, heirs to a tradition older than Persia itself. So even while Cambyses wore the crown, rebellion simmered beneath the surface. Cambyses himself didn't last long. After only a few years on the throne, he died under strange circumstances during a campaign in the east. Some say it was an accident, others say suicide, and still others believe assassination. Whatever the truth, Egypt briefly saw a flicker of hope. Without Cambyses, perhaps Persia's grip would loosen. But the empire didn't collapse. Instead, Darius, known as Darius the Great, took control. Under him, Persia didn't just hold Egypt, it systematized it. Darius was a builder and organizer. He divided the Persian Empire into satrapies, provinces, each with governors who collected taxes and enforced order. Egypt became one of those provinces. On the surface, Egyptians kept their temples and rituals. Darius even funded temple construction to win support from the priesthood. But make no mistake, Egypt was now just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The pharaoh wasn't the center of the world anymore. He was a title Persians used when convenient, nothing more. Still, Egyptians didn't stop resisting. Rebellions broke out repeatedly. Some were crushed quickly, others dragged on. Each time, Persia tightened its grip. Egyptian soldiers were forced to fight in distant wars, in Greece, in Asia, battles that had nothing to do with their homeland. To many Egyptians, this must have felt humiliating. Their ancestors had once sent armies into Asia to conquer others. Now, they were the conscripts of a foreign master. And yet, here's the irony. While Egypt was politically weakened, its culture remained so strong that even conquerors couldn't ignore it. Persian kings built inscriptions in Egyptian style. They called themselves pharaohs in official documents. They knew that to rule Egypt, they had to wear the mask of Egyptian kingship. But everyone could see the mask was thin. The divine authority was gone. This tension, the appearance of pharaohs still ruling, but the reality of foreign kings, created a kind of double life for Egypt. Temples still honored the gods. Priests still carried out rituals. Festivals still happened on the Nile. But behind all of it was a Persian army, Persian taxes, and Persian officials making the decisions. The everyday farmer along the Nile might have pretended life went on as before, but the truth was clear. Egypt was no longer in control of its own destiny. Every rebellion that failed deepened that truth. Egyptians tried to restore independence several times during the Persian period, but without the strength of earlier dynasties, they couldn't hold out. They didn't have the wealth, the manpower, or the leadership to stand against the Persian war machine. By the time the dust settled, the message was unmistakable. The age of the pharaohs as true rulers was over, and the age of Egypt as a conquered land had begun. And this new reality spread beyond Egypt. To the Greeks across the Mediterranean, Egypt was no longer seen as a power to be reckoned with, but as a land under Persian control, a land of wealth, yes, but also a land that could be claimed. To Persia's rivals, Egypt wasn't untouchable anymore. It was just another prize waiting for the strongest hand to grab it. This was the deeper consequence of Pelusium. The loss wasn't just Psamtik III's crown. The loss was Egypt's reputation as a world power. Once gone, that reputation never returned. From then on, every empire that rose, Persia, Greece under Alexander Rome, would look at Egypt and see something they could own. So while Persian soldiers marched through Egypt's temples, while priests lit incense before gods as they always had, the truth lingered like a shadow. The pharaohs had lost their last real chance. Their defeat had turned Egypt into a possession, not a power. The Persians may have worn the crown of pharaoh, but the Egyptians never stopped dreaming of shaking them off. Every generation after Pelusium, some leader or priest would rise up, claiming it was time to restore the old order, to bring Egypt back to the days when the Nile's kings ruled on their own terms. And every time, the Persians crushed it. But sometimes, the resistance came close. There were moments in the 5th and 4th centuries BC when Egypt actually did break free, if only for a short while. Around 404 BC, Egypt managed to push the Persians out and enjoyed nearly 60 years of independence under what's called the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties. For a brief window, it seemed like the old dream wasn't dead yet. Pharaohs once again stood on their own thrones, temples were restored, and pride surged through the Nile Valley. But here's the problem. The world had changed since Pelusium. Egypt wasn't the same powerhouse it had been centuries earlier. Even when it regained independence, it didn't regain dominance. Its rulers were constantly on guard, watching Persia, Greece, and other powers move around them. Egypt was free on paper, but vulnerable in reality. The days when a pharaoh could expand Egypt's reach into Asia or crush foreign armies were gone. By 343 BC, Persia came back stronger. Under Artaxerxes III, they marched into Egypt again and retook it. Just like that, independence ended once more. This time, the blow was harder. The Persians punished Egypt severely. Temples were looted, cities were stripped of wealth, and the people felt the weight of conquest more than ever. The hope that Egypt could truly stand alone was fading fast. And as fate would have it, another storm was building to the north. While Persia was re-establishing control, a young Macedonian king was rising, Alexander the Great. He had already beaten the Persians at Granicus and Issus, and in 331 BC, he crushed them for good at Gaugamela. Suddenly, Persia itself was falling apart, and when Persia collapsed, Egypt's fate shifted again. In 332 BC, Alexander marched into Egypt. The Persians, already weakened by his victories, couldn't hold it. Egyptians, tired of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. And here is where it gets interesting. Alexander didn't come in as a conqueror who wanted to smash Egypt. He came in like Cambyses had centuries earlier, but with more respect. He honored Egyptian gods, visited temples, and even went to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where priests supposedly declared him the son of the god. Egyptians embraced him not as a foreign oppressor, but as a new pharaoh. But make no mistake, this wasn't independence. It was simply another form of foreign rule. Alexander's arrival ended Persia's hold, but it didn't restore Egypt's old glory. Instead, it marked the beginning of the Hellenistic era. After Alexander's death, Egypt passed into the hands of the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty that ruled for centuries. They wore the crowns of pharaohs, built temples in the old style, and even had themselves depicted as traditional kings of Egypt. But behind the imagery, everyone knew the truth. The real age of the pharaohs, the age when Egypt was ruled by its own blood, had ended long ago at Pelusium. This is the legacy of that single defeat. Pelusium wasn't just a lost battle, it was the turning point. From then on, Egypt's rulers were always foreigners. Persians, Greeks, Romans. The crown might look the same, the rituals might continue, but the heart of Egypt's power was gone. When Alexander the Great took Egypt in 332 BC, it felt like a new dawn. The Persians were hated, their rule remembered as heavy-handed and disrespectful, so Alexander's arrival almost looked like salvation. Egyptians saw him as different. He sacrificed to their gods, visited temples, and even made the famous journey to the Siwa oasis, where the oracle of Amun supposedly declared him the son of the god. For a people who had lost faith in the divine power of the pharaohs, this was powerful symbolism. But behind the ritual and ceremony, the reality hadn't changed. Egypt wasn't independent again. It was simply changing masters. Alexander added Egypt to his empire, the same way he added Babylon, Persia, and India, as part of a larger dream. He founded the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, a city that would soon become one of the most important centers of learning and trade in the ancient world. This was no small gesture. Alexander knew Egypt's location and wealth made it invaluable, and Alexandria was meant to lock Egypt into his empire permanently. The Egyptians accepted him because he seemed to respect them, but Alexander didn't stay long. Egypt was only one piece in his vast conquests, and soon he was marching east toward Persia and India. He left behind governors to administer the land, Greek and Macedonian officials who spoke little of the local language but carried out his will. Egypt was secure, but it was no longer Egypt's own. When Alexander died in 323 BC at just 32 years old, his empire shattered. His generals, men who had fought beside him from Greece to India, divided the lands like vultures over a feast. For Egypt, this was the birth of a new dynasty, the Ptolemies. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's top commanders, seized Egypt for himself. He declared himself Pharaoh, and from that moment, a Greek dynasty ruled the Nile. Here's where things get complicated. The Ptolemies weren't Egyptian by blood, but they understood that to rule Egypt, they had to look Egyptian. So they played the role. They wore the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. They built temples in the traditional style. They had themselves depicted on the walls, offering to the gods, just like the pharaohs of old. On the surface, it seemed like the old ways lived on. But scratch that surface, and the truth was obvious. The Ptolemies spoke Greek, not Egyptian. Their court was Greek. Their closest advisors and soldiers were Greek. Even the city of Alexandria, which quickly grew into Egypt's greatest city, was not built in Egyptian style, but in Greek style, with theaters, gymnasiums, and libraries. The old Egyptian capitals like Memphis and Thebes were sidelined, replaced by a new, foreign-looking center of power. For ordinary Egyptians, it must have felt like living in two worlds. In the villages along the Nile, life went on almost as it always had. Farmers still planted and harvested according to the flood. Priests still chanted in temples, and festivals still honored the gods. But in Alexandria, a new Egypt was being created, one that was Greek at the top and Egyptian at the bottom. The Ptolemies were clever, though. They knew they had to balance both worlds to stay in control. That's why they leaned so heavily on religion. By presenting themselves as pharaohs, they made it easier for Egyptians to accept them. And to their Greek followers, they claimed descent from Alexander himself. It was a double identity, designed to hold together a land that had already been broken by Pelusium centuries earlier. But even with this balancing act, cracks were always there. The Ptolemies weren't loved like the pharaohs of old. They were rulers tolerated because they maintained order and wealth. They brought stability, but not independence. Egypt had power again, yes, but it was in the hands of foreigners. And everyone knew it. This dual reality would define Egypt for the next 3 centuries. On the one hand, the temples still echoed with the language of the pharaohs. On the other, Alexandria became a symbol of something entirely new, a crossroads of Greek, Egyptian, and later Roman culture. It was the jewel of the Mediterranean, but it wasn't the Egypt of Ramses or Thutmose anymore. It was the Egypt of Ptolemy. And that shift can be traced all the way back to one defeat, Pelusium. Because once the chain was broken, once Egyptians saw a foreigner wearing the crown, the spell was never restored. Every ruler after, even those who called themselves pharaohs, ruled in that shadow. The Ptolemies may have given Egypt stability on the surface, but beneath it, their dynasty was messy, chaotic, and often violent. They ruled for nearly 3 centuries, yet much of that time was consumed by family feuds, court intrigues, and endless civil wars. Instead of a united front like the pharaohs of old, Egypt found itself trapped in the drama of a foreign royal family that treated the throne more like a prize than a duty. From the beginning, the Ptolemies made a choice that shaped their dynasty. They married within their own family. Brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces. It was all done to keep the bloodline pure. To the Greeks, this was unusual, but to the Egyptians, it echoed the traditions of old pharaohs, like the ones from the New Kingdom. It was a way to appear more Egyptian, but in practice, it bred rivalries, assassinations, and constant instability. Still, the Ptolemies were wealthy. Egypt, under their control, was a rich land, with the Nile's grain feeding not just their people, but much of the Mediterranean. Alexandria became the empire's capital, a city filled with scholars, merchants, and sailors from all corners of the known world. Its great library became legendary, its lighthouse one of the wonders of the world. To outsiders, Egypt looked prosperous, maybe even powerful again, but the truth was different. The Ptolemies relied heavily on foreign mercenaries to keep order, because the Egyptian people were not fully loyal to them. Rebellions broke out often, especially in Upper Egypt, where resentment against Greek rule was strongest. Peasants and priests longed for the days of native pharaohs, even though those days were centuries in the past. And as the dynasty dragged on, the cracks widened. Some Ptolemies were capable rulers, others were disasters. Many left the kingdom weaker than they found it. By the 2nd century BC, Egypt was struggling to hold itself together. The once proud land that had dominated the ancient world was now a pawn between bigger powers, especially Rome, which was rising fast. Rome watched Egypt carefully. To the Romans, Egypt was too important to ignore. Its grain could feed their armies, its wealth could fill their coffers, and its location made it the perfect jewel of the Mediterranean. The Ptolemies, sensing this, tried to balance Rome, sometimes allying with it, sometimes bribing it, sometimes resisting it. But Rome was patient, and Rome was relentless. By the 1st century BC, the dynasty had shrunk to its last gasp. This is where Cleopatra enters the story. She wasn't just another Ptolemy. She was the final act of the entire tradition of pharaohs. Unlike many of her ancestors, Cleopatra actually tried to embrace Egyptian culture more deeply. She spoke the Egyptian language, the first of her dynasty to do so. She presented herself not just as a Greek queen, but as pharaoh in the full ancient sense. To many Egyptians, this must have felt like a spark of something old, a glimpse of what had been lost since Pelusium. But Cleopatra lived in a world where Egypt was no longer strong enough to stand on its own. The Romans were the superpower now, and Egypt's survival depended on Rome's politics. Cleopatra's famous relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony weren't just romance. They were strategy. She was fighting to keep Egypt independent, to stop it from being swallowed whole by Rome. For a moment, it seemed like she might succeed. With Caesar, she regained her throne after a bloody civil war against her brother. With Antony, she built an alliance strong enough to challenge Octavian, the man who would later become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. But the odds were against her. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Cleopatra and Antony's forces were defeated. The dream of holding Egypt against Rome died with that battle. A year later, both Antony and Cleopatra were dead, and Egypt became a Roman province. For the first time in its long history, Egypt wasn't just ruled by foreigners wearing the pharaoh's crown. The Romans didn't even pretend. To them, Egypt was no longer a kingdom. It was a possession. And just like that, the last flicker of pharaohs, even in name, was gone. Cleopatra's death wasn't just the end of a queen. It was the final seal on what had begun at Pelusium centuries earlier. One defeat had set Egypt on this path, and now the path was complete. By the time Cleopatra stood against Rome, she wasn't just another queen trying to save her throne. She was carrying the weight of 3,000 years of history. Egypt had been ruled by pharaohs since before the pyramids, and even under foreign dynasties, the image of the pharaoh had survived. Cleopatra was the last to wear that crown, and she knew it. Her rule was different from her Ptolemaic ancestors. She wasn't content to be a figurehead propped up by foreign mercenaries. She tried to connect with the Egyptian people in ways her dynasty had ignored. She learned their language, took on their traditions, and presented herself as a living goddess in the old style. To many Egyptians, this wasn't just politics. It felt like the pharaohs of old had returned. But Cleopatra's Egypt was weak compared to the giants around her. Rome dominated the Mediterranean, and its armies were unmatched. Egypt's wealth made it desirable, but its strength was no longer enough to defend itself. That's why Cleopatra played the political game as fiercely as any general fought on the battlefield. Her partnership with Julius Caesar was her first great gamble. With his support, she reclaimed her throne after a civil war against her brother Ptolemy XIII. Caesar's backing gave her power, but it also tied Egypt's fate to Rome more tightly than ever. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Cleopatra's position became uncertain again. That's when she turned to Mark Antony. Together, they weren't just allies or lovers. They were a political force meant to counter Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. Cleopatra and Antony imagined a world where Egypt could hold its place as more than a Roman pawn. Their alliance brought strength and hope, but it also painted a target on their backs. The final test came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet faced Octavian's forces in a decisive naval clash. It was the kind of battle where everything, not just kingdoms, but eras, was on the line. And when their fleet broke and their forces scattered, the outcome was clear. Antony and Cleopatra had lost not just a battle, but the future of Egypt itself. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra tried to hold on. She fortified the city, negotiated with Octavian, and even considered sending her children into hiding. But she must have known the truth. Egypt was finished. Antony fell on his sword, dying in her arms. Cleopatra, refusing to be paraded through Rome as a prisoner, chose her own death. Ancient writers tell us she used an asp, a venomous snake, though the exact method may never be known. Her death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the final end of Pharaohs. No king or queen after her would ever rule Egypt as an independent land. Octavian annexed Egypt into the Roman Empire, turning it into his personal province. The grain of the Nile became fuel for Rome's growing power, and Alexandria became just another city in the empire. To Egyptians, Cleopatra's death must have been a bitter blow. She had represented their last chance, their final link to the pharaoh's ancient authority. With her gone, the line was broken forever. The age of the pharaohs, an age that had stretched across millennia, was finally over. And the spark that set this ending in motion. That one defeat at Pelusium, centuries earlier. When Cleopatra died in 30 BC and Egypt became a Roman province, the curtain finally closed on one of the longest-running dynasties in human history. For 3,000 years, pharaohs had ruled along the Nile, building pyramids, raising temples, and declaring themselves the children of the gods. But their end didn't come suddenly. It came centuries earlier, on a battlefield at Pelusium, where one defeat changed everything. That battle in 525 BC, where Cambyses of Persia shattered Psamtik III's army, broke more than Egypt's defenses. It broke the illusion of pharaohs as untouchable. Once a foreign king could wear the double crown, the magic was gone. From then on, Egypt's rulers were outsiders. Persians, Greeks, Romans. They could copy the rituals, carve their names on temple walls, and play the role of pharaoh. But the soul of Egyptian independence had already been lost. The centuries that followed were echoes of that first fall. Persia turned Egypt into a satrapy, a province of empire. Alexander the Great swept through, building Alexandria and replacing one master with another. The Ptolemies tried to balance Greek rule with Egyptian tradition, but their dynasty collapsed into infighting and weakness. Cleopatra stood as the last hope, tying herself to Rome's power in a desperate attempt to preserve Egypt's independence. When she failed, Rome didn't bother with ceremony. They didn't pretend to be pharaohs. They simply annexed Egypt, stripping away the last fragments of sovereignty. And so the story that began with Pelusium ended with Rome. One defeat set in motion a chain that couldn't be reversed. Egypt never again decided its own destiny. Its monuments remained, its culture endured, but the age of the pharaohs, the age when kings and queens ruled by their own authority, was gone forever. This is why Pelusium matters. Not just as a battle where one young pharaoh lost to Persia, but as the moment when the balance of history tipped. Before it, Egypt had been a world power, proud and independent. After it, Egypt became a prize, passed from Persia to Greece to Rome, always ruled by others. 3,000 years of tradition ended not with a slow fade, but with one sharp break. And from that break came the long shadow of foreign rule. The pyramids still stood, the Nile still flooded, the temples still echoed with prayers, but the throne was never Egypt's again. That's why historians say Pelusium was more than just a military defeat. It was the end of an age, the moment the pharaohs lost their world.